That morning, the courtroom felt colder than it should. The air held the sterile scent of wood polish and tension, like even the walls were waiting to take sides. Cameras clicked somewhere behind me, their flashes reflecting off the brass nameplate that read Judge Ruth O'Connor, my mother's friend. Of course. Councilwoman Elaine Rivers sat across the aisle, her posture rehearsed, her chin lifted with political grace. Beside her, Patrick Rivers, my father, avoided my gaze, as if guilt could be disguised as silence. Her attorney arranged documents with the calm of someone who already believed victory was inevitable. Then came the words that pierced deeper than any legal claim. This girl only knows how to waste what she doesn't deserve. That girl was me, the daughter she had ignored for years. Now the obstacle between her and the fortune my grandmother Jean Abbott had left in her will. It wasn't greed that chilled me. It was the ease with which she performed cruelty. The judge nodded faintly, almost imperceptibly, and the lawyer smiled, that small, confident smirk of men who think connections outrank truth. But I had been preparing for this moment since the day I learned that justice in Redmond Hills often came with a price tag. My pulse steadied. My voice didn't shake. When I rose, the sound of the chair scraping against the marble echoed like the beginning of an ending. 2 words. That was all I needed to end the performance. Judicial disclosures. If you've ever watched someone twist family into a weapon, you'll want to hear what came next. Hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe, because what followed in that courtroom rewrote everything they thought they could control. Childhood never felt like the beginning of anything. It felt like waiting in a house built for someone else's ambitions. Redmond Hills was perfect on the outside, lawns trimmed, families polished, but inside our home, affection was rationed like an expensive perfume. My mother, Councilwoman Elaine Rivers, treated warmth as strategy. My father, Patrick Rivers, lived in the quiet space her ambition left behind. I learned early that silence pleased her. Approval came from stillness, obedience, invisibility. But Jean Abbott, my grandmother, never asked for quiet to love me. She carried sunlight into every room, smelling of cedar and lavender. Her hands were steady, her laughter unfiltered, and her kindness deliberate. She said money should serve purpose, not pride. Jean founded a small community foundation that gave scholarships to local students. I used to follow her there every weekend. The walls were covered with photos of graduates she'd helped. They remind me why we're here, she once said. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. Elaine and Jean shared nothing but blood. My mother saw generosity as weakness, my grandmother saw it as duty. When elections arrived, Elaine turned into a stage version of herself, perfect posture, rehearsed smile, speeches about family values she never practiced. Jean stayed away from those events, calling them theater. Their distance became permanent long before I was old enough to choose sides. Jean never flaunted wealth, but she had plenty. Years of quiet investments made her independent in a way my mother couldn't control. That independence irritated Elaine more than poverty ever would. When the forgetting began, it was small. Misplacing keys, repeating stories, losing track of days. At first, I blamed age. Then I learned the word Alzheimer's, and the world tilted. I was 22 when Jean sold her big house and moved into a cottage at the edge of town. I moved in with her. My mother didn't argue it was convenient for her campaigns. Those 2 years became my education in love. Jean's mind flickered like an old film, skipping scenes but never losing tone. Even when she forgot my name, she smiled as if her heart still remembered. She hummed old songs while I paid bills and cooked dinner. I learned patience from repetition, courage from exhaustion, and grace from watching her fade without bitterness. Elaine visited only when cameras did. She brought photographers, flowers, and false concern. The nurses whispered about how polished she looked, as if presentation equaled affection. I stayed silent because anger was useless against someone who turned guilt into branding. The final winter was the quietest. Jean spoke less, slept more, and held my hand longer. I found her old notebooks one night, letters, recipes, speeches she never gave. Among them was a sealed envelope labeled for Callie. Inside was a letter and a notarized will. She left everything, her estate, savings, and foundation, to me. She wrote that kindness had to be inherited the same way money was, or it would vanish. When she passed that spring, the house felt larger, but I didn't cry. Grief had been living with me for months already. I organized the funeral alone. Elaine arrived in black silk, greeting donors with camera-ready sorrow. Her speech about family unity drew polite applause that made my stomach twist. For a while, peace existed in paperwork. I managed the estate, answered condolences, and began running Jean's foundation. Then an envelope appeared at my door bearing the logo of Keller and Associates, my mother's attorney. Someone had told her about the will. That evening, she arrived without warning. I remember the click of her heels, the tremor in the air when she saw the documents. The mask of public grace slid off her face, revealing something sharper than grief. Power doesn't mourn, it plots. In her eyes, I wasn't her daughter anymore. I was the mistake standing between her and control. That was the day I realized love in our family had skipped a generation and the one who had cherished me was gone. What remained was the beginning of a war I hadn't chosen but would have to finish. By early autumn, peace had become a rumor. The hills around Redmond glowed gold, pretending calm, while tension coiled underneath. My mother had found her rhythm again, not in motherhood, but in warfare disguised as politics. It began with whispers that grew their own names. Articles followed, dressed as compassion but engineered like traps. Daughter inherits fortune amid family concerns. Every line suggested manipulation, each photo placed beside words like greed and betrayal. In Redmond Hills, rumor was currency. Councilwoman Elaine Rivers knew that better than anyone. She crafted sympathy like policy, her smile timed for headlines. I didn't need confirmation. The fingerprints of her strategy were everywhere. My father called once, his voice cautious, asking if I could resolve things quietly. He sounded like someone bargaining with a storm. I ended the call gently. Grief was no longer my weakness, it had turned into armor. I hired Alicia Grant, a lawyer whose calm unnerved people. She didn't offer comfort, she offered process. Her first instruction was simple: document everything. The goal wasn't to fight emotion with emotion, but pressure with precision. Soon, envelopes arrived, daily legal threats, demands, insinuations of exploitation. Each one tried to exhaust rather than accuse. My mother's campaign machine was operating perfectly. Drain the will before the trial began. Alicia built order from chaos. We created a log for every call, every statement, every piece of manufactured outrage. They want reaction, she reminded me. Give them records instead. Meanwhile, my mother smiled on television. Her campaign commercials dripped sincerity. She spoke about protecting family heritage and honoring her late mother's values. The same hands signing motions against me gestured about morality to voters. Redmond Hills applauded her story. I became the contrast that made hers shine brighter. Reporters waited outside my office, pretending curiosity. The foundation's work was overshadowed by scandal that never existed. Through the noise, Alicia stayed unshaken. Facts, she said, age better than rumors. So we collected them: old bank statements, donation records, foundation archives. The more we gathered, the clearer the pattern became. One name appeared too often to ignore: Judge Ruth O'Connor. At first, I dismissed it as coincidence. The city was small, professionals overlapped. But Alicia found financial disclosures showing consistent personal donations from the judge to Elaine's campaigns, each one carefully below public reporting thresholds. Curiosity turned into certainty. I began searching through online archives, buried social posts, local news photos. Again and again, they appeared side by side. At fundraisers, private dinners, charity galas, their smiles looked natural, practiced, synchronized. These weren't glimpses of professionalism. They were evidence of comfort connection strong enough to blur boundaries. My grandmother used to say, integrity doesn't erode overnight. It dissolves quietly until the reflection in the mirror belongs to someone else. That's what I saw in those photos. When public slander failed to break me, the threats shifted tone. Anonymous messages warned me to think carefully. A car lingered outside my gate for hours one night. Fear tried to introduce itself, but I had learned discipline from caregiving stillness under chaos. Alicia insisted we stay silent publicly. They'll use your defense as confession, she said. So we worked quietly, layering facts like bricks. My apartment filled with folders and timelines, every line connecting my mother's power to the judge's favor. It no longer looked like a home, but like a blueprint of corruption. Elaine's empire ran on control. Mine was learning patience. She had always won by being louder. I would win by being exact. Each document became its own verdict, each photo a mirror she couldn't escape. The final connection arrived one evening in a forgotten event archive. Judge O'Connor had officiated the opening fundraiser of Elaine's first campaign. Her signature sat beside my mother's on the sponsor list, the ink preserved in glossy print. It was small, almost elegant and damning. I stared at the evidence under the desk lamp. The glow painted my hands pale, steady, deliberate. Somewhere between the fear and fatigue, a realization surfaced. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. It was about exposure. For years, she'd built a machine that shaped perception. Now, the same machine had left a trail too intricate to erase, and the pressure she designed for me was starting to crush her instead. Morning arrived without promise. The sky was a pale sheet above Redmond Hills, its color indifferent to the storm moving quietly beneath it. Every battle needs structure, Alicia said. I took her advice literally. My living room became a war room, folders stacked like bricks, timelines pinned across a corkboard, photos marked in neat columns. I didn't need rage to fight. I needed rhythm. Each document felt heavier than paper. They carried years of my mother's entitlement, the fingerprints of a system designed to protect her. Councilwoman Elaine Rivers wasn't just a mother defending pride. She was a public figure defending image. An image had rules sharper than law. Alicia Grant reviewed every file with the patience of a surgeon. She built our case piece by piece, turning suspicion into sequence. I watched her transform my fear into evidence, my memories into logic. The process numbed me at first. It demanded discipline, not emotion. While others lived their lives, I lived in records, tax forms, donation receipts, property transfers, social event logs. The monotony became its own kind of prayer. Between the lines of numbers, a pattern sharpened. Judge Ruth O'Connor appeared again and again, listed on charity boards, tagged in campaign newsletters, photographed at fundraisers hosted by my mother's committee. The connection was no longer coincidence. It was design. Elaine had always mastered optics. Friendship with a judge wasn't corruption when hidden beneath philanthropy. Every gala became camouflage, every donation a thread in the same silk veil. The brilliance of her strategy was that it looked harmless. But paper doesn't lie, and cameras never forget context. I began collecting not just documents, but details: the dates of overlapping events, the sequence of financial filings, the repetition of names on guest lists. Each discovery was a brick in the wall Alicia wanted me to build, a barrier made not of anger but accuracy. Outside, the narrative remained loud. My mother's public team continued its quiet theater. Billboards, interviews, charity drives, all perfectly timed to drown any hint of scandal. She smiled beside children holding scholarships my grandmother had once funded, rewriting legacy into advertisement. Watching it felt like grief in a new costume. I stopped expecting fairness. Justice, I realized, wasn't balance, it was endurance. The more pressure they created, the steadier I became. The human body adapts. The human heart learns restraint. Alicia filed preliminary motions, anticipating the storm. Every draft passed through her hands until language became weaponry. She believed in precision the way soldiers believe in armor. Let the evidence speak before you do, she told me once, and I understood she wasn't talking about court strategy but survival. Nights blurred into quiet mornings. Sleep became optional. I woke with ideas for cross-referencing files, checked timestamps, verified signatures. Fear had no room to grow inside routine. One evening, while arranging photographs chronologically, I noticed something subtle: the same floral arrangement on two separate event stages, years apart. The sponsor lists were identical. Beneath the printed decorum lay a clear pattern of financial interdependence between the judge's charity and my mother's re-election fund. That small repetition, unnoticed by most, became the thread that tied everything together. Alicia confirmed it within hours. The records aligned perfectly. "This isn't influence," she said, scanning the papers. "It's infrastructure." She was right. What I'd uncovered wasn't corruption born from desperation. It was architecture built over years, steady and deliberate. It explained why every door I'd tried to knock on closed politely in my face. The network wasn't protecting my mother's innocence. It was protecting its own convenience. I realized then that the wall I was building wasn't just defense. It was containment, a way to trap the system that had cornered me. Each document tightened the space around their lies until movement became impossible. By late winter, our case stood ready. Alicia assembled the evidence into sequences even a biased mind couldn't ignore. I memorized every exhibit, every timestamp, every name. When fear tried to speak, I replaced it with data. Somewhere in that discipline, the balance shifted. My mother's campaign looked flawless from the outside, but internally her control was cracking. Anonymous resignations surfaced from her staff. 2 sponsors withdrew their support, citing ethical concerns. Her silence grew louder, and silence was the one thing I had learned to read. The wall was complete, not of bricks, but of truth so meticulously arranged it could withstand anything built on pretense. And as the court date approached, I understood the quiet satisfaction my grandmother must have felt in every act of patience, because revenge, when built carefully, doesn't shout. It stands. The morning felt sterile, like time itself had been disinfected. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited with their lenses raised like weapons. Inside, silence had weight. The smell of varnished wood mixed with something colder anticipation. I took my seat, breathing in the stillness that comes before a verdict. Councilwoman Elaine Rivers sat across the aisle, wrapped in composure too perfect to be real. Her lawyer, Brian Keller, arranged his notes with theatrical precision. Between them, power hummed like electricity behind glass. At the bench, Judge Ruth O'Connor looked poised, almost detached. Only I knew the fault line beneath her calm years of entanglement dressed as friendship. The air itself seemed aware of it. When the proceedings began, Brian spoke in the rhythm of manipulation. His arguments were rehearsed to sound humane and appeal to morality, not greed. He painted me as misguided, too young to understand the responsibility of inheritance. Every phrase tried to shrink me into something fragile. I didn't react. Alicia had taught me the discipline of stillness. Let them exhaust themselves first. The hearing stretched like an elastic band. The clock ticked without mercy, each minute pulling tighter. I could feel the audience shifting sympathy, being molded by tone rather than truth. That was my mother's greatest talent, performance mistaken for sincerity. When her turn came, Elaine delivered what sounded less like testimony and more like a campaign speech. She spoke of community, sacrifice, and a daughter who lost her way. Her voice trembled at all the right moments. To anyone who didn't know her, it would have been moving. To me, it was choreography. Then it was my turn. I rose, carrying the folder that had become both shield and sword. The room seemed to shrink as I walked to the table. The light above the judge's bench reflected on the polished floor like a warning. Facts don't need volume. They only need sequence. Alicia's voice echoed in my memory as I opened the first file. Each exhibit built upon the last donation records, photographs, correspondence, every layer revealing the quiet network between the judge and my mother. No accusations, just alignment. Patterns so precise they didn't need interpretation. When the final photograph slid across the table, the energy in the room changed. It showed Judge O'Connor standing beside Elaine at a fundraising podium, hands clasped, smiles identical. The image was harmless alone but devastating in context. The silence that followed felt alive. Even Brian Keller's pen stopped moving. For a fraction of a second, the judge's control fractured. Her breath caught, her hand trembled. Then, like instinct, she nodded, agreeing with my mother's earlier claim about my unworthiness. That tiny motion was enough. The mask cracked in public view. I didn't need to speak. The truth had spoken through posture, through reaction, through the small betrayal of human instinct. Alicia's motion for recusal followed the next heartbeat. The courtroom froze as the judge struggled to recover composure, but professionalism couldn't undo what the audience had already seen. Ruth O'Connor's ruling was swift, mechanical, stripped of confidence. She upheld the will, confirmed my inheritance, and dismissed all claims of undue influence. Her voice wavered through the closing statement, each word an act of damage control. Elaine's face remained still, but the stillness was different this time. It wasn't strategy, it was shock. Control had always been her religion, and I had just turned faith into evidence. When the gavel fell, the sound echoed like closure made physical. The reporters moved first, chasing quotes, chasing chaos. I didn't move. I watched my mother stand, her expression flickering between disbelief and calculation. That moment, the second she realized the narrative was no longer hers, was the quietest victory I'd ever known. The days that followed blurred together, stitched by headlines and static. The courthouse emptied, but its echo stayed. Outside, reporters turned fragments of my story into currency. Inside, the silence of victory felt too heavy to celebrate. Winning never sounded like triumph. It sounded like the clock finally exhaling after holding its breath too long. Judge Ruth O'Connor submitted her resignation within a week, citing personal health reasons. The statement was short, the consequences longer. The State Judicial Review Board opened an inquiry before the ink on her resignation dried. Each report revealed another thread: campaign donations, private appearances, favoritism disguised as philanthropy. Her name became shorthand for compromised ethics. Councilwoman Elaine Rivers followed quickly down the same slope. The City Council launched an internal ethics review. Donors evaporated. Former allies turned to distance themselves. Her campaign office closed overnight, its windows papered in blank white sheets where her slogans used to be. Her social media feeds filled with silence, and for a woman who had built her life on visibility, disappearance was the cruelest sentence. I read none of the coverage. Alicia handled everything, filing closing motions, archiving every document for future reference. She said we'd done more than win, we'd exposed a pattern. That word, exposed, sounded clinical, detached. But exposure was never painless. It burns. At night, I felt the burn most sharply. My phone buzzed with congratulations I didn't know how to answer. Gratitude felt misplaced. Revenge felt hollow. Justice is quieter than people imagine. It doesn't roar, it releases. In Redmond Hills, people began rewriting their allegiances. The same voices that once praised my mother's leadership now praised accountability. The shift was surgical, impersonal, inevitable. Politics doesn't apologize, it adapts. I passed by the courthouse a few days later. The steps looked different, though unchanged. I realized places never hold the weight, people do. And those who carry truth eventually set it down, not because they're done fighting, but because they're tired of carrying it alone. Alicia's office called with final confirmations the estate was officially mine. Every property, every share, every dollar my grandmother had entrusted. The law had spoken, there was nothing left to contest. Yet, the moment I signed the last page, I didn't feel wealth. I felt gravity. My grandmother's handwriting flashed through memory. Kindness must outlive fear. The phrase echoed in quiet defiance of everything my mother had stood for. Elaine never reached out. No apology, no denial, not even anger. Her silence felt strategic at first, but later I understood it was the absence of power, and she had no language for that. The news cycle moved on as it always does. A new scandal took my mother's place, a new controversy devoured yesterday's outrage, but reputation doesn't move as quickly as headlines. It lingers, slow and unforgiving. For weeks, I avoided mirrors. Not out of guilt, but disbelief that it was over. Justice doesn't arrive with ceremony, it settles like dusk. You don't notice it until the light has changed. People expected satisfaction from me. They wanted a smile, a quote, a neat ending. But closure isn't applause, it's exhaustion shaped into peace. In time, I returned to my grandmother's foundation. The office still smelled faintly of cedar, her scent embedded in the wood. I walked past the photographs of students she'd helped, their smiles untainted by politics. For the first time in years, I felt alignment, her purpose beating quietly beneath my skin. Every empire collapses differently. Some crumble in noise, others dissolve in silence. My mother's empire faded like ink left in the sun, proof that no performance can survive the absence of truth. The court's decision had been final, but the real verdict was internal. I had inherited more than property. I had inherited perspective, the kind that comes only from watching power disintegrate under its own weight. Justice didn't restore what I'd lost, but it gave meaning to the loss itself. And meaning, I realized, was the only inheritance that never depreciates. Spring arrived without ceremony. I learned that endings rarely announce themselves. They simply stop asking for attention. The house felt honest again, quiet for the sake of quiet, not because someone had stolen the sound. I moved through rooms like a custodian of air and light, choosing what to keep and what to release. Grief loosened its grip, not because I forgave anything, but because exhaustion chose a softer shape. I changed numbers and locks. I archived every file with the precision Alicia Grant taught me, then closed the cabinet and left it closed. I sold property that belonged more to performance than to memory, and kept the places that remembered kindness. I wrote boundaries into my calendar the way others write holidays. They were not defenses, they were definitions. Councilwoman Elaine Rivers never called. Absence, once a tactic, hardened into identity. Patrick Rivers sent a card. I set it aside without resentment. Some relationships are only coherent at a distance, and distance needs no explanation. My inheritance would not include making room for people who never learned how to arrive. Work became lighter when I stopped carrying it like a verdict. At the foundation office, I sorted scholarship letters with care. I met students who measured success in early buses and late-night shifts, who treated opportunity like oxygen. The scale inside me reset. Money returned to its proper size, a tool, not a purpose. I rebuilt the foundation's governance, independent audits, conflict of interest disclosures, term limits, public minutes, scaffolding that keeps institutions upright when people fail. Stability isn't dramatic, but it keeps the roof from collapsing quietly. Redmond Hills adjusted too. Ordinary days returned, farmers markets, school concerts, weekend traffic near the trailheads. I learned to enjoy unremarkable afternoons, The kind that never make headlines because they don't need to. Peace prefers anonymity. One clear morning, I walked the perimeter of the garden behind the office and imagined how Jean would have arranged the rose bushes. I didn't summon her for permission. I honored her by making decisions without apology. Love does not ask to be performed, it asks to be practiced. People called me brave. I was not brave. I was consistent. I showed up for the quiet work after the loud work ended. I kept promises I made to myself, especially the uncomfortable ones. I let consequences belong to the people who earned them. Accountability is not revenge. It is respect for cause and effect. I chose not to reconcile. Not out of anger, but out of accuracy. A boundary isn't a door locked from spite. It is a map that refuses to redraw itself for travelers who never learned the terrain. Elaine built a life from optics. I chose a life from values. We were done translating. What remains of the story is not spectacle. It is maintenance. I maintain the foundation. I maintain the terms of my grandmother's will. I maintain the rooms that remember her handwriting. Maintenance is humility in motion, the admission that good things stay good when someone keeps oiling the hinges. If the ordeal taught me anything, it is that truth is patient and love is specific. Truth does not sprint, it accumulates until denial runs out of space. Love does not generalize, it takes attendance and learns names. When both arrive at once, power yields without applause. I end here, not because the work is finished, but because I understand the difference between closure and quiet. Closure is what the world asks for when it wants a line to quote. Quiet is what you grant yourself when you no longer need one. And I chose that peace for good. If you want a moral, consider this. Guard your boundaries like assets, build your proofs like bridges, and choose the kind of peace that doesn't require witnesses. Some inherit money, some inherit courage. I was fortunate to inherit both, but only one of them changed what mattered. The day I changed my number, the city felt wider. Austin's skyline stretched, like it belonged to someone else now. I didn't tell anyone. My silence became the announcement. Disappearing wasn't running, it was choosing stillness after years of noise. I boxed my life neatly, documents, receipts, traces of another version of myself. Sorting through them felt like sweeping out a house that had been quietly burning for years. Every paper I folded was a reminder. Survival is also a kind of housekeeping. Weeks passed without interruption. Peace came in unremarkable shapes: coffee that stayed warm, mornings that didn't begin with dread, bills that had only my name on them. For the first time, I wasn't responsible for someone else's chaos. Freedom didn't feel loud, it felt weightless. Mom's silence replaced her guilt. Dad called once from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring. There was nothing left to explain, and explanations had never saved us anyway. Families like ours were stitched together with obligation, not understanding. Once you stop pulling the thread, it unravels on its own. One afternoon, a letter arrived, my name and Daphne's printed side by side. Balance resolved, it read. I held it longer than necessary. 2 words, heavy with meaning. It wasn't triumph. It was evidence that something finally ended without my help. Someone said Daphne had moved to Colorado, working again, doing better. Maybe she was, maybe she wasn't. The truth no longer needed my permission to exist. I didn't wish her well or badly. I just wished her away from my peace. Forgiveness didn't visit like I expected. It didn't knock or ask to be understood. It came quietly, disguised as indifference. I didn't forgive her because she deserved it. I forgave her because I didn't want to carry her anymore. Life became smaller in the best way. Simple meals, a steady rhythm, plants that survived without attention, the kind of quiet that felt earned. I learned that solitude wasn't loneliness, it was clarity after too much noise. Sometimes I thought of that dinner table, of the applause that started everything. It used to sting. Now, it was just background music from a story I'd already finished. I didn't need them to understand my version. I just needed to keep living it. Then, a postcard came, no name, just mountains and the words, "You were right." I didn't frame it or save it. I read it once, then let it slip through my fingers. Some apologies mean more when they're carried away by wind. Spring came back to Austin. I walked downtown one morning and passed a cafe where a family was laughing loud, messy, uncontained. I saw my reflection in the window, alone but not empty. For the first time, I didn't wish to belong anywhere else. Freedom, I realized, wasn't rebellion. It was refusal, the quiet decision to stop paying rent in places where your soul no longer fits. If Daphne ever learns that lesson, I hope it's kind to her, but I'm done being her teacher. Stories like ours don't end with reconciliation. They end with distance measured not in miles, but in peace. And if you've listened to mine, thank you. Maybe you've been the one who stayed too long, or the one who finally walked away. Either way, I hope you find the courage to choose peace when love starts to cost too much.